Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the session. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Here we are. And there we go. So we're going to continue the discussion that we started with the previous session. This is going to be really strongly linked to the previous session, but essentially we're going to be kind of formalizing our thoughts, or learning how to formalize our thoughts. And I'm really going to be discussing the process of kind of the planning, monitoring, and evaluation for cultural tourism projects, and explaining how data fits into all of this. Here we go. There we go. So I'll talk about kind of the role of data in cultural tourism projects, how we can think about data collection in the pre-planning stage, how we're going to scope data and the project planning, and then a bit about data management and collection. So just to follow on from the previous session, this session aimed to really get us thinking about our goals for the pilot studies. You know, what were the unique selling points? What kind of tourist segments do we want to attract? Why do we want to attract them? What are the potential benefits and losses to the community? And beginning to think about the key performance indicators that we could set up. So we're going to continue that and formalize it. We're going to also address maybe some potential concerns that pilot studies might have of, you know, why should we be collecting data? What will we use it for? What data should we be collecting even? How do we collect it? How are we going to analyze it? How do we measure progress? And maybe we have an idea of these questions in an academic sense, because we have a lot of academic partners, but the project isn't just, you know, an academic experiment. How are we going to use this on the ground in practice? And also, I think a question that's on a lot of people's minds of, how can we show the value of these projects to ensure their continued success after INCULTUM? How can we use data to accomplish that? So here, when we think about data and planning for data and using data, we've got to think about it in terms of the project itself and the project planning and how it fits in. So most of these questions that we're asking are really going to be answered in the pre-planning and planning stages. But what we're using it for is going to be for monitoring and evaluation. So that kind of continuous tracking and measurement of progress, and then also that systematic review of performance. This, you know, this session is going to focus mostly on the pre-planning and planning stages, but I'll mention a little bit of the monitoring and evaluation. So when we talk about the pre-planning and planning, what exactly are we talking about? In our pre-planning stage, we're really thinking about analyzing the situation on the ground as it is right now. What is the tourism situation at our pilot site and also in the wider region, and trying to understand how kind of the tourism offering at our pilot site fits into that wider offering, how it fits into that wider region. And then the planning stage is where we begin to we kind of talk about what was really discussed in the last section, understanding what are our goals and our objectives, what do we want to achieve, when do we want to achieve it, developing our strategies or actions, which is, you know, how do we get from the situation we're at now to the situation we want to be in the future, and then identifying, you know, policies, programs, projects, activities, you know, specific actions that we can implement to achieve what we want to get. And then also, importantly, developing a monitoring and evaluation strategy. So how are we going to measure progress? And this isn't just the INCULTUM project. This can be just, you know, your site in general, beyond INCULTUM. I'll just briefly mention the monitoring and evaluation side. Like I said, we're not going to focus too much on that. We're going to focus on the rest of it. But what do we mean by monitoring and evaluation? When we talk about monitoring, that's sort of the day-to-day operations. That's asking, you know, are the activities leading to the expected outputs? Are we doing things on time and within budget? Are there any delays? Are there any unexpected results? Is there anything happening that makes kind of management think we really need to change our plan? And also kind of reviewing regularly, how do the stakeholders feel about this pilot? So that's that sort of day-to-day review and progress checking. And we talk about evaluation, that is a systematic review of the performance. It doesn't happen on a day-to-day basis. It happens at maybe a regular interval, like say yearly, and maybe even every 5 years you have a bigger review or a bigger evaluation, where you're systematically reviewing the performance and you're comparing your achievements against your short-term and long-term goals and objectives. So you're asking yourself, have our aims and objectives actually been achieved? How were our resources in terms of time and money and staff used? Could they be used more effectively in the future? Are the benefits of our project likely to last? Were we actually responding to the needs of the local community? And how do our project's actions actually fit the needs of the local community and the wider region and the tourism sector, and maybe even on a national basis? So again, not just looking very specifically, but also kind of about that big picture and how our project fits into that big picture. So going back into our data collection in the pre-planning stage, what we were doing here is scoping. We're scoping the local tourism industry, and we're trying to understand the profile of the local tourism industry. So we want to have not just what's happening on our local site, but also the broader area. So there's 3 key things that we can kind of think about and collect, which is the tourism resources and assets, the institutional elements, and tourist concerns. In terms of tourism resources and assets, this is, what else is around me? What kind of attractions are there? Where are they located? What kind of activities do they offer? And then thinking, how do I fit into that? And then also the facilities that are available. So how do people get there? Where are they going to stay? Where are they going to eat? And how are they going to pay for things? I know most people maybe pay by card now, but especially with non-EU or non-European international visitors, it does happen. Cards get declined, you need to go to a bank, you need some way of paying for things. In terms of the institutional elements, this is what kind of institutional factors are there? What is the situation? What kind of capacity do they have? And also what kind of potential partners do we have, people we can work together with? So that's your list of stakeholders that people have been putting together with. That's putting together an overview of the local tourism sector, your local government capacity. What kind of trainings do they offer? Seminars, workshops, anything related to tourism? What kind of resources are there available to you? And in terms of the infrastructure, we really want to know, okay, maybe we have public transportation, but the bus only runs twice a day. What is the condition of it? What is the availability of it? Are there visitor information centers? What kind of condition are they in? Are there rest areas with bathroom? I know we have a lot of rural areas with long, maybe hiking paths. What is the condition of the signs and the information points? And in terms of the tourist concerns, we can think about, are they concerned about the public transportation? Are they concerned about language and communication barriers? Are they concerned about the possibility of a wildfire in the summertime in rural Spain and Portugal? So it's just assessing what's going on and thinking how we can address these issues, what resources are available, and how we fit in into the overall tourism industry. We also want to develop a profile of tourists and visitors. So this is including, visitor demographics. I've put some examples here. Characteristics of their stay. How long do they tend to stay in the area? Do they stay overnight? Do they travel as part of a package tour? Do they visit other attractions? Where are they visiting? How much money are they spending? The site discovery. How do they hear about it? But sometimes it's not even just how they hear about it, but where do they go to learn more? And then also, we know that site level information may not be available for all sites, especially those that are still kind of under development, but it's really useful to try to profile visitors to the wider area or the wider region and try to understand, Do we think we're going to be attracting completely new tourist segments, bring in a completely new group of tourists that aren't typically visiting this area? And if so, how are we going to do that? This kind of goes back to our unique selling point. How are we going to bring them in? Or are we going to draw part of the existing tourism segment? And again, let's say in the Algarve or in Spain, how are we going to get those Sunridge beach tours away from the beach and into these rural areas? How are we going to kind of change their minds and draw them in? So this doesn't have to be formal data even. There's, you can draw it from observation if you have to, but just really think about it and think critically and try to get some kind of a written record so that you can go back and reflect on it and see how the process has changed. So in terms of project planning, in the planning stage, I'm going to go through the stages of project planning, and then I'll explain kind of how data fits into all of this. So when we think about project planning, we have to start with very clear aims and goals. And this is something that Carson kind of mentioned, that sometimes the pilots might be mixing what can be accomplished within INCULTUM in kind of the short term or medium term versus what are very long term goals. And in some cases, they're not very well defined. So we need to think, number one, what are our aims and goals that we want to achieve in the long term? We could think about this as maybe, what's our 5-year plan? Or what's our 10-year plan? And we also need to think about, is this something we can do by ourselves, or do we need to work with partners? Who are those partners? How do we reach out to them? What are our different roles in terms of achieving these longer term objectives? Then we want our objectives, our short and medium term objectives. This is, what are we going to do in the next 6 months? What are we going to do maybe in the next year? Or for example, in INCULTUM, over the next sort of 2 years. When we're thinking about these objectives, they need to be very well defined, very specific. So we can use what we call SMART criteria. Is it specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound? So with specific, this is who is doing what, when are they doing it, how is it being done? When we talk about measurable, it needs to be something that it can be counted or observed or analyzed or tested in some way. Attainable means we need to specify an amount or a level that needs to be reached. This is kind of leaning into setting targets. It needs to be relevant. So are we measuring what we want to measure? Are we actually accomplishing what we want to accomplish? Is it a really good measure of our expected outcome or our expected results? And it needs to be time bound. It needs to be something that can be realistically achieved within the deadline that we're setting for ourselves. And when we're thinking about our objectives, we can't just think about them as a single objective, but also as a package that maybe individually they all fit the SMART criteria. But once we put them together, we just have too many objectives. And as a combination, it's just too much to get done in the time frame. So once we have these kind of longer term goals, these shorter term goals, we need to decide our actions. What are the specific actions we're going to do to achieve these aims and objectives? This is, any kind of policy, programs, projects, activities, can be things done, very localized at the site level. It can be with partners, but they're very specific actions that we're taking to achieve our objectives. Once we know our long-term goals, short-term goals, we know the actions we're going to take, then it's going to be a lot easier to establish targets. And this is where we're beginning to link it into data. So we're saying, what specifically do we want to achieve? When will it be achieved? These need to be very definitive statements. It needs to specify specific values that we want to reach. Once we have this, we need to determine our baseline. If we can, I know not every site has historical data, but try to collect data for as far back as you can, ideally 3 to 5 years if you can. This can even be, again, go back to, the broader tourism segment. If you don't have it on your site level, say, this is what we know for the region, and use that to inform and reflect on, your objectives, your actions, your targets, and say, are our targets realistic, kind of given these recent trends and the current levels. Two things that are also really important here and a part of the planning stage is scenario planning. So think about 3 to 5 realistic or feasible scenarios. It can be, you know, optimistic scenarios, and it can be pessimistic scenarios. One of them should always be kind of a continue as is or a do nothing. If we just kind of keep going as we're going, what do we think the situation will be? And then you can think of at least one positive and one negative, maybe 2 positive and 2 negative. Don't make it too complicated for yourself, but think about your targets and think about, you know, if things go well, we might do a bit better. If things don't go well, how bad could it be? The last is to develop your monitoring and evaluation strategy. And this is a written document that really outlines the logistics of how you're going to do the day-to-day monitoring of your progress, and also when you want to do an evaluation, how you're going to do that evaluation, how you're going to disseminate it. So getting into the data side of things, first we need to think about the barriers. What goes wrong in this? Well, first of all, as we kind of mentioned, it's a big barrier is setting too many aims. Often the aims are not well defined, or they're just very broad. They're all kind of all encompassing, like, or the aims are just not achievable in the time frame. So an example Carson brought up, it's very funny you brought it up. I have it here as well. Multiple pilot studies said, you know, we're really concerned about depopulation in our area, and we want to reverse depopulation. So this is just, it's really big. It's a really big problem. It's a bit outside the scope of INCULTUM, I think. We can all agree on that. This is going to involve wide policy changes involving a lot of different actors. It's probably not going to be accomplished within INCULTUM alone. But if we also think about it, it's not necessarily a problem. I'll get into this in a little more. It's actually an effect. It's kind of a symptom of a lot of underlying problems. So what we really want to do is not try to solve this big, thing that's not very well defined, but actually go at those underlying problems and see which of those underlying problems can we tackle through our work with INCULTUM, and also after INCULTUM, small things that we can do as a pilot study. So in this case, I think problem tree analysis can be really helpful. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to map out the problem, really identify the root causes and the effects. And we're breaking this problem into smaller, well-defined parts, things that are more achievable. And that helps us to understand, who are the stakeholders? What are the processes involved? How can we prioritize things? How can we define objectives? And how can we determine what resources are needed to address these issues? So if we think about the problem of depopulation, as I mentioned, it's an effect. It's a symptom. What are the things that cause depopulation? What are the problems that exist? I've listed 2 here. There's many more, but 2, for example, could be low income levels. Another is maybe there's just few employment opportunities in your area. When we're thinking about low income, maybe it's a little difficult for us to achieve. That probably would involve some national policies in terms of changing the minimum salaries, but few employment opportunities, that's something I think is achievable. It's something that we can make a difference with. So let's think about what causes there to be few employment opportunities. That could be, number one, the seasonality of tourism. Maybe you have a lot of employment opportunities at certain times of the year and fewer at other times of the year. Maybe it's the case, I think we've all seen them, the chain tourist shops that just sell the really cheap trinkets from China. Maybe tourist money is just going to goods that aren't made locally and to companies that aren't locally owned. Maybe it's also that the local community lacks skills to be working kind of in the tourism sector. So when we think about these causes, they're smaller, and there's something that we can do to achieve them. On our next slide, I'll show you how. So we can think about our problem and turn that into a goal. So here we know there's a few employment opportunities. So let's set our goal to be, we're going to increase local employment opportunities. And we're going to take those causes and turn them into our objectives. So I've just taken 2 as an example here. We can think we had the local community didn't have skills. So our objective now is to improve the tourism skills in the local community. We had maybe tourist money wasn't being spent locally. Well, now let's turn our objective into increasing the number of tourism related businesses owned by the local community. Now we have well-defined objectives. What actions can we take to achieve these objectives? So for example, improving skills in the local community, maybe we can offer a course on how to become a tour guide. We can offer some kind of a training. When we're thinking about increasing the number of tourism related businesses, we can offer workshops on how to produce local handicrafts, so we can train locals in producing that. We can get more people actually producing local products. We can also maybe offer workshops, education for tourists, for example. So it's not just about training the locals, but it's also, getting tourists involved and helping them understand the value of these local handicrafts. We can also maybe work in combination with other partners, co-hosting workshops on starting a business. So now we have very specific, well-defined actions. Let's turn them into indicators. Well, if we're talking about courses, for example, our course on how to be a tour guide, how can we measure whether that's been successful? Well, we can have the number of training events that we offer per year, or and then maybe also the number of trained tour guides. And then we can think about our targets. So we know we can create a baseline. What is the number of trained tour guides right now? And think in 2 years or 4 years, we want to have, say, a 50% increase. The number of training events, it doesn't have to be a percent increase. It can just be a target number. So we want to have at least 4 events, at least 4 training events per year, or at least 1 training event per year. So we're taking this big problem, turning it into a goal, taking those causes, turning them into objectives, thinking of very specific actions we can take, and then indicators that help us know whether those actions were successful. So here's a few examples from pilot studies, just to give an idea of different indicators that you could have, because it seemed like some pilot studies were saying, what kind of data should we be collecting? And these are things to think about beyond just harmonizing data across INCULTUM as the success of our pilot study. How can we measure that? So if you're, for example, developing tools for students, well, you need to have some way of knowing, are students actually coming? Are we increasing students? So maybe you should have an indicator for the age of the visitor. Are they sort of within, school age or university students? Are they coming as a family? Are they coming as part of a school group? If you want to increase community engagement, how are we going to measure that? How do we know if the community is more engaged? You could, for example, collect a volunteer list and have the number of volunteers. You could have a mailing list and collect the number of people who are locally on that mailing list. If we're talking, for example, that developing a new digital tool, well, you can have the number of downloads from an app store. You can have the number of visits on a website. If, for example, they have user accounts, you can see how many people go and use our tool regularly. They come back. They don't just visit it one time. Okay. So now that we have an idea of how to turn our kind of problems into aims, objectives, and think about data and think about the data that we should be collecting, now let's talk about the actual collection process. So as I mentioned before, this plan for the data collection process should be outlined in your monitoring and evaluation strategy. This strategy should include information about professional standards, ethical guidelines, so that's data protection, confidentiality, standards of conduct, diversity, inclusion, and equity considerations. You also want to outline what methods, what approaches, what tools are we going to use to monitor and evaluate. It's going to evaluate how you're going to, it's going to outline, how your data will be collected and managed, how you plan on analyzing it, and how you plan on presenting your findings. These decisions should really be made and thought about in the planning stage. You don't want to get in a situation where you collect a lot of data and then a year later you think, well, we have all this data, what do we do with it? You want to have some good idea of what we want to do ahead of time, instead of ending up a year into it and thinking like, oh man, I wish we'd collected data on this and we don't have it. So now is a good time to really be outlining these things and thinking about these things. If you have not already, some pilots may already have this. When you're thinking about data collection, there's a few things that we really need to think about. Again, going back to what are our aims, what are our objectives, outcomes, what potential indicators could we have? But we also need to prioritize because, as I'm sure all of you know, in any project you've done, sometimes you run out of time, sometimes you run out of money. So you want to prioritize what are the data needs, what are essential to our project, both in terms of academic use and also in terms of practical use. What is absolutely essential and what are things that we would like to have? And you can also, those data wants, you can prioritize them as well and say, this one we could, if we absolutely have to, these can be dropped easily. We don't necessarily care about them, whereas some others are like, we would really, really like to have them. We're going to try to keep them as much as possible. So prioritize the data that you want to collect. Also think about the methods of data collection. What types of data is needed? It doesn't have to be, official statistics. It can be, as we've kind of mentioned, engagement with the community, putting together surveys, questionnaires, conversations, focus group discussions. It can be a lot of qualitative data. So what type of data do we need to answer the questions we want to answer and to measure what we want to measure? Investigate what data already exists and think really about what data is missing in all of this. And also the methods that you use to collect data, are they valid and are they reliable? I think this is really important in terms of focus group discussions, surveys, questionnaires. You really want to make sure, for example, you're reaching the communities that you want to reach, and that your surveys are designed in a way that isn't sort of pushing people into a specific answer unintentionally. You also need to think about your resources for data collection. Who is going to be responsible for this? Not just today, but also, we want these tourist sites to exist, perpetually in the future. We want them to sustain in the future. So is there a role that can be filled? Maybe not permanently. Maybe, for example, you have a research assistant and you just have this position that you want to maintain over time. But then also, what are the additional costs for data collection? In some cases, it's just going to official statistics. It's pretty easy. But maybe, for example, if you're developing a new tourist route, that might be kind of difficult to know how many tourists are going, how many, who's going, what gender are they, what age are they, what kind of groups are they? So in these cases, maybe you need to hire enumerators to go out with like an iPad or a phone and go to the path, maybe over a week or so, and say, just record, just observe and see who's passing. And that's a way of getting data collected, but that obviously comes with extra costs. And that's in terms, you also need to think about the timing of the data collection, at what stages, how frequently, and like that example I mentioned about people going into the field and just recording, how long does that data collection expected to last? You want to just go out one day? Do you want to go out, over a week? What kind of time do we expect? And in surveys, for example, community surveys, what kind of a time frame do you want those surveys to happen in? I've got a few examples of best practices for data management and data collection. When you're thinking about data collection, you want to provide extremely detailed, very clear instructions. In my experience, you can almost never assume anything. Don't assume they know anything. Really, really go into a lot of detail about this. Another thing that's very important is keeping track of the metadata. I think you can develop a code book. I highly recommend developing a code book. This outlines every data set. You're saying what's in the data, what's the structure of it, what's the layout, what are the variable names, how are they defined, what are, if we're using acronyms, they're kind of shorthand, what do they mean? What is the source of the data? Where did we get it from? a hyperlink if you got it from a website, the date that you collected it. In my experience, I have collected data from official statistics and gone back, re-downloaded it, tried to recreate it just to confirm my process. And then the data was different. And we spent a month, and then it turned out someone figured out the original data collection, the data just been updated. It was estimates, and then it was updated later. And it just took us forever because we didn't have this recorded. So it's a lot easier it'll save you a lot of time and money if you just write it down the first time. It's also important to record the data creators or the authors. So this isn't necessarily the source, it's for example, the member of your team who's put this data set together. Because then if you have questions about it, you know who to get in touch with. You can also include any other acknowledgements. You want to acknowledge your research assistants. You want to acknowledge the members of your team and who's done what. This is a great way to keep track of that. Keep a track of the funding sources, any other kind of people or organizations you'll need to acknowledge later. And if you do any manipulation to the data, if you're doing any kind of calculations or transforming it in some way, you want to include notes on the processes that were used to generate that data. I also highly recommend developing some kind of organizational system, having a very clear file structure and developing file naming conventions. So the idea of your metadata and your organizational system is that if you get a new team member in, it should be very easy for them to get into it and get situated. They shouldn't be spending weeks trying to figure out where everything is organized and where should I find this, and oh, there's some file that's really confusing. Who do I go? Who do I ask about this? Make it easy for your new team members. This is really going to help the longevity of the project. Big mistake with data: save frequently, automate saving, save regularly. I can't stress that enough, especially if you're doing a lot of manipulation or you are manually entering data. Save, 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 save. Save a lot. As a part of that, you can ask your universities about a file versioning system where not just track changes, where I can see the specific changes that have been made, because I think that can be kind of cumbersome in Excel and in Word sometimes, but a file versioning system where you can see, let's go back to the version we had yesterday, or let's go back to the exact version we had 2 weeks ago. This is really helpful when mistakes happen. Sometimes big mistakes happen. So having that file versioning system is really helpful. Another thing is always keep a backup of the raw data, your original data. Have your originals in a folder and don't touch them, and make a copy for any kind of manipulation, any kind of analysis you want to do. Always do that on a copy. Always have the raw data that you can go back to and fall back on. A couple of other best practices. Really make sure you're making a difference between data files and files where you're doing analysis and you're creating figures. Those should be done in separate files. But if you're using Microsoft Excel, you have to be very careful. It can try to automatically create links between spreadsheets, between sheets within the same file, and also between different files. And it is so easy to break those. And if you break those, it is a nightmare to try to fix sometimes. So only include data in a data file. You can, again, make a copy to make figures and analysis, but do that in a separate one. Try to keep your data sets relatively small and easy to manage. Try not to make them too big and too overwhelming. You want to split the large data sets into small logical parts, not where there's too many and they're kind of silly how small they are. Just don't make it too big and too overwhelming, and make it easier to kind of manage. You can look into something called data normalization, which is a way of splitting your data into smaller logical parts. Data normalization helps avoid unnecessary repetition in data. I won't go into that now, that's a big concept, just a term for you to look into. You can also ask for example, your university about a relational database. Instead of using Excel, you can try to put your data in a database. When you're working in a spreadsheet, don't include multiple data tables on a single sheet. Break them into separate sheets or break them into separate files. And also, if you in your data file, you want to have only the first row for column headings. I have a whole appendix for you guys to look into with a lot more information, no time to talk about it. This is for reference tables. This is for your data files. If you're putting together presentation files for dissemination, that's totally different. But the one data table per sheet and the first row only for column headings, that's to make it a lot easier to import into a wide variety of statistical management tools and software. Really, if you're using Excel or another kind of spreadsheet, be aware of the common Excel errors. I think everyone has probably dealt with Excel trying to convert random numbers into dates or dates into numbers. Be aware of these and store it in some kind of an open format, such as a CSV for long-term access, because, for example, historically, Microsoft has not always had version compatibility. If you have like a newer version of Excel, it wouldn't always work with the old version of Excel. So store it in an open format, and then it's never a problem. Got some advice for you guys in terms of identifying errors in data. When you're diagnosing errors, you want to first identify suspicious data. So look at data that's missing. Look at extreme values and try to identify, are these extreme values plausible or are these extreme values some kind of a mistake? Double check the data that you're entering, especially if you're manually entering, and have a second person review it if you can. Do random spot checks within the data to see if there's mistakes. You can also put together summary tables and do visual checks just to see, does it look right? You know, no one is aged 115 or something like that. Try to spot easy errors. When you're diagnosing errors, you always want to try to identify the magnitude of the errors and the source of the error. You have a few different options when you find mistakes in the data. For example, if you're taking surveys, it's really common if you have like a written piece of paper and you're trying to manually enter that into Excel, it's really easy to make a mistake. So one option is to do nothing. It's the most conservative option, to just leave it there. It's usually not a problem if you have really big data with few errors, but if you have a smaller data set and there's a lot of errors, this is usually not a good option. If, for example, you are, like I said, you have a survey where you have the written piece of paper, you can go back to the original piece of paper and see, okay, this was just entered in wrong, and you can correct it. But only modify if you really know the correct answer or you really know the intention is obvious. You can delete the data. It can be a valid option if the errors are not systematic. You know, you have to be careful about cherry picking the data in this case, even if you're not cherry picking it intentionally. When you discuss the data later, you have to be extremely transparent about what data you excluded and why. And in some cases, you may just remeasure if your time and resources allow. With missing values, things get a bit more complicated. First step is always to see how many are there, how widespread is it. Try to identify the reason for the missing value. Was it that an option wasn't available? Was it that the respondent just didn't choose to answer? So it's a good practice to include things like, I don't know, I don't want to answer, not applicable. Always include that in your surveys. You can also take a look and see if that missing data can be imputed. If you have other information or other sources, can you maybe take an average? In some cases, that's an option. You've really got to take a look and see, do we just need to delete these observations or delete these variables from the analysis completely? But it's also important to understand, is the data missing at random or is it missing systematically? Are there specific groups of people, for example, that choose not to answer a question? If that's the case, then this can introduce bias into your analysis, and you really need to think through how could the fact that we're missing certain people impact our results. few other considerations. These are really important, I guess, especially if you're dealing with surveys. You could have an issue called selection bias, where certain groups just don't want to participate, or you have overrepresentation of certain groups. You could have a non-response bias, where people just refuse to answer, or they're not able to answer. Attrition is, let's say you're surveying your local community and you want to go back to the same businesses over time. Maybe some businesses just drop out halfway through, or they just stop responding. If you're doing, for example, interviews or phone interviews, a survey over the phone or a survey in person, there's a thing called acquiescence bias, which is where respondents have a tendency to respond very positively. They want to answer in a positive way. So they might tend to agree with you, even if in other circumstances they wouldn't. You could have people just giving what they think is a socially acceptable answer. This is a social desirability bias. This is something that was talked about a lot after Brexit, for example. There's also a thing called anchoring bias, where a respondent's answer is influenced by some kind of a reference point. So if you ask someone, for example, your income level, how is it relative to the average income level of the country? A lot of people tend to think they're more average than they actually are. So they might say, oh, I'm about average, but maybe in reality, they're well above average. So just keep that in mind in how you're forming the questions. There's also recall bias. People may have difficulty remembering certain information. So if you're interested in, how much money have you spent on this trip? Maybe people just are like, I don't know. I have to do a lot of math. I don't recall. So in this case, you can maybe find some anchor for them to have a point of reference to, or provide, for example, I don't know, spending categories. Did you spend between 0 and 100 euro? Have you spent between 100 and 500? Something where it's easier for them to kind of think of and respond. And in terms of the researcher, when you are designing things, you have to keep in mind that the question order can actually influence the response. It's not always easy to address this, to fully randomize a survey, but the question order can actually influence the response. You also want to be careful about leading questions or having a wording bias, which is wording that kind of nudges the respondent to a particular answer. And confirmation bias, that you end up focusing on information or focusing on responses that sort of reinforce or confirm your hypothesis or your beliefs. I think that is, I will skip to the end here. That's just a summary. And for now, I guess we'll take any questions. So we have time for questions.
Perhaps while questions emerge, let me just say here a word of thank you to Sara for this very thorough and knowledgeable overview, and also extremely concise. So Sara has more or less summarized a 10 ECTS course of the full semester on just 30 slides. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
May I?
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you very much, Sara. I found it very useful. There are some things that we have to reflect on, of course.
Yeah.
I think that was also the purpose of the workshop and your intervention. We've been thinking a lot about how to collect data and what kind of data to collect. And of course, we will need some assessment from you, just to try to avoid errors and to have some really useful data. But we have our first challenge is that what we are proposing is something completely new. So we don't have any kind of previous data and experience apart from the official statistics about tourism in the area where we are working. And we have suggested in the KPI part of our homework some elements. You have referred some some, in our case, we are going to work with the cultural routes in the ditches, in the irrigation channels. So we have some statistics or some quantitative data that we can collect. How many paths are we able to consolidate or to establish, and the agreements already signed, that it's the way that we're working with local communities, and the touristic companies contacted and interested in the product and so on. But we were also thinking about the idea of trying to control the tourist flow through the pass using sensors. Yes. So of course there you have just the number, but not disaggregated elements. You said in your intervention that we can maybe try to go sometimes or establish a strategy and try to count some specific days to see more or less the kind of people that is using that might be useful, but I don't know if that is representative or can be representative or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that case, it's obviously not going to be representative, but I think in this case, it's also better to have at least some data, if that makes sense, to have some idea, because I think it won't be perfect, but I think in this case, you can also do it on maybe different days of the week, or different times of the year, and you know, get some picture and build some picture. In this case, I think your data collection, that is going to be very time intensive. You could also try to have someone maybe stopping people on the path and doing some interviews. So it won't be fully representative, but I think it's still useful and still valuable to you guys to get that kind of information and get it that way.
Okay, and now we are also preparing, well, we have already prepared and it's already working on a very short, not interview, but asking the people if they are interested in the product that we are proposing, if they want to pay for that, or if they won't pay for that, which are the conditions or the things that could be more attractive for them. So we want also to have some previous data also to value the opinion of the general public that's oriented toward the general public, and of course to the local communities that we are working with.
Yeah, I mean that sounds great. The willingness to pay, especially, those are always really interesting research questions to me. I love that, the willingness to pay.
I guess that's something we should discuss with you so that we won't get lost in that.
Of course, yeah. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me afterwards, especially you know, sort of reflecting. You have time to think and reflect, and you're welcome to email, and we'll do our best to kind of guide you and answer your questions.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Arthur Felipe Gregorio, you were next.
Okay, thank you, Sara, for your magnificent presentation. I have two questions that in data evaluation are, I think, for me, more difficult to address. That's qualitative data assessment, and another is satisfaction evaluation. In cultural tourism, qualitative data assessment is very important. And not only tourism as satisfaction evaluation important, but also stakeholders satisfaction evaluation. It's very important. I think these are two areas that this project must address with special care and attention because of its focus. What do you think about it?
No, I completely agree. It's not just about, I think, the number of tourists, but also absolutely the degree of satisfaction. I mean, the number of tourists is only going to tell us so much, but I think this is where you can look at satisfaction in a number of ways. So you can look at it in terms of say you have a website. You can register the website with, Google has, what is it called? Basically, Google has like a dashboard that you can create where you can see the users that visit your website, and you can see kind of the regions that they're visiting from. And if they're a registered user, maybe they have a bit more information in their Google profile, and you can get a breakdown. And I think you can also see, you know, return visits to your website. If the same visitor is clicking through multiple pages, that's some measure of satisfaction. If I'm highly interested, I'm clicking through, I'm spending more time on your website, I'm coming back to your website. For example, the Irish pilot actually is developing an online community, so you can look at how much are they talking on these, you know, these user boards, you know, how often do they come? I think that's really relevant. But also, like you mentioned, that's not possible for everyone. So you could look at something that Carol and I are doing, for example, with TripAdvisor data. You can have Facebook pages, social media engagement. You can look at surveys. So I think there's a wide variety of getting that information. And I think it's absolutely something that is of growing importance. And some of the speakers this afternoon are going to talk about digital engagement in a lot more detail and how that can be measured. And you're never going to hear someone say, you know, I don't know, I visited the Colosseum on Assassin's Creed and now I don't have to go because it's a perfect representation. Digital engagement is always complementary to on-site engagement. So I think this is something that's often missing. I think Vincent.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Sarah, for bringing so much information. And actually, it will take me several months for the digestion of all that. Anyway, I would like to address a point you didn't mention, and that is the subject of a small report about a survey we made 3 years ago that, as far as I know, Flore Copin shared with the community. It is the fact that collecting data is also an opportunity to create a touristic community on a territory by raising the interest of local people and local stakeholders in tourism issues, and also to share real data, because there are lots of representation of tourism which are completely not fitting the reality on tourism. That's very important. And that's certainly an aspect we'd like to share with you, because for us it was very effective and very useful to develop this data collection by involving groups of inhabitants, group also of decision makers wherever they are. And the workshops we organized were, I think, were really very important, just to really create a shared objectivized vision of tourism on the territory. And so we would be very happy to bring that in the process. And obviously what we need now, after the general presentation you've made, is a more directive approach of what we should do. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it would be great. I think it sounds like other partners would definitely be interested in some of the things that you guys have been doing. I think that's also something that, just for the longer term, these things can be included in your monitoring and evaluation strategies. In how are we going to get the information about our tourist site out to the public? And that doesn't just mean in terms of, you know, getting it to Horizon 2020, how are we performing? It doesn't just mean getting it to your local government in terms of applying for maybe extra funding. It can, or, you know, tourists and promoting tourists. It can also be in engaging the local community and how can we promote our site and what we've been doing to the local community, and also what have we done in terms of community engagement and how is community engagement evolving. These are all things that can be incorporated into your monitoring and engagement strategy, for sure.
We have time for one last, perhaps, short question. Sotiris, the word is yours.
Yes, I would like to put on the table our experience until now. We saw, for example, in the survey we did in the pages that are for the culture and the websites that refer on the culture of the area and stuff like that, that there is no English translation of whatever exists in the area. So it's something important that maybe INCULTUM and our pilot could help the area to do, to communicate in English and in French, maybe in other languages, the local the local cultural heritage. So what we want to do also is to take the data for the tourism of the area that we can find, and we will find from the statistical agencies. Some of this data we showed you before, and we want to analyze them and have a page only for locals, so they can check the touristic data of the area analyzed, and also the hotels and all the touristic industry of the area can check what's happening on the touristic the tourists and the inputs in the area. And that's something we would like to do, to open the data, also the data that refers to the tourists. These data are needed from the local enterprises, the touristic enterprises, and also the data that open data from the area that tourists need to come in the area. So there are two open two categories of data, big categories that refer to different to tourists and to these data. If they are opened and given back to local society and tourists, could raise totally the area in touristic terms.
That's a really nice plan. That sounds like an excellent, you know, activity that you guys are doing, a plan that you guys have. And there was so much more I wanted to talk about. As Carl said, it was already a bit much. So my slides actually include, I included a lot of additional information in an appendix. And one of the things I talk about is kind of how we can storytell with data. Because I think that's very important. It's not just about putting numbers, but it's about having something meaningful with the numbers. And a part of that is really understanding your audience. And in your case, you have two audiences. So one is what is the narrative that we want to tell? What's the story that we want to tell to tourists? And also what's the story that we want to tell to our local community? And how can we present this information in a way that is very easily accessible? So there's more information for you guys to look at. I have also links, hyperlinks in my presentation. You should be able to just click any of the sources and it'll take you to those websites. So anyone who's interested, they'll be, I think Antonella and the promoter will be putting all of this information online somewhere. But I think for now, do we need to take a break? I'm not sure.
We have just one word. We have a training portal where it will be very nice to publish your presentation, Sara. Congratulations, it was very interesting. So everybody in the consortium and outside the consortium can access the information. And we will open soon a YouTube channel related to INCULTUM and its pilots and its resources. And I think that the registration of your presentation would be very welcome for our audiences. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you also very much from my side, Sara. This was very informative. I think with this we will stop here now and reconnect. Well, very soon, already in 12 minutes at 12 o'clock CET.